August 1945. Somewhere in the Philippine highlands, dawn crawls over a camp surrounded by rusted wire and watchtowers. The war is ending, but no one here breathes easily. Inside the fence, Japanese prisoners sit in silence, their khaki uniforms bleached by months of sun. They speak only in whispers, words carried carefully, like secrets the air itself might betray. Then, from the guard post, a sound startles them. An American voice, calm, steady, speaking in perfect Japanese. Ohayo gozaimasu. Good morning. The prisoners freeze. Some lower their eyes. Others glance at one another, unsure whether this is mockery or mercy. For years they had been told the enemy would torture, humiliate, annihilate. But now, through the barbed wire, they hear their own language spoken with respect. A cup of tea is placed on a wooden table. The guard smiles, not out of pity, but understanding. Fear begins to shift, just slightly, into confusion. And in that fragile silence, the war's deepest illusion begins to unravel. The illusion that humanity cannot cross enemy lines. That morning, for the first time, the prisoners whisper not in fear, but in wonder. In 1945, the Pacific War had become a vast graveyard of nations' pride. From the jungles of Burma to the ruins of Manila, Japan's empire was crumbling under the relentless advance of Allied forces. But even as cities fell and fleets burned, one thing did not: the Japanese soldiers' refusal to surrender. For many, captivity was worse than death. From their earliest training, they had been taught that surrender was the ultimate disgrace, a stain upon the family name, a betrayal of the emperor. The imperial rescript to soldiers and sailors had made it clear: do not suffer the shame of being taken alive. On distant islands like Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, this code of death before dishonor was lived out with terrible devotion. Men charged tanks with bayonets. Civilians leapt from cliffs. Entire garrisons chose suicide over capture. Allied troops, witnessing this fanatic resistance, came to believe that the Japanese were incapable of humanity, and perhaps undeserving of mercy. In turn, Japanese propaganda reinforced the fear. Leaflets, broadcasts, and training manuals warned that American and Australian soldiers would mutilate captives, mock them, and execute them without trial. Prisoners were told that Allied camps were places of starvation and humiliation, a fate worse than any battlefield death. This mutual dehumanization was one of the war's most corrosive legacies. When surrender finally came, it did not feel like peace. It felt like falling into the hands of monsters conjured by years of hatred and lies. By 1944, Allied forces began to take larger numbers of Japanese prisoners on Guadalcanal, in New Guinea, and across the Philippines. They were not the proud officers of the early campaigns. Many were exhausted, malnourished, and haunted by the shame of survival. In their minds, they were already ghosts. Yet when they reached Allied camps, something unexpected awaited them. Instead of torture, they found structure. Instead of mockery, order. Instead of bullets, food. Guards issued blankets, organized routines, and treated injuries. It was not kindness, at least not at first, but it was discipline, and that discipline carried its own strange mercy. Still, distrust ran deep. Some prisoners refused to eat, believing the rice was poisoned. Others bowed silently, too afraid to speak. They watched every movement of the guards, searching for signs of cruelty that never came. Then one day, in several camps across the Pacific, something remarkable occurred. A guard, sometimes American, sometimes Australian, spoke to them in fluent Japanese. It was more than a surprise. It was a shock. The sound of their mother tongue, shaped by an enemy's voice, tore through years of conditioning. Some prisoners wept openly. Others turned away, unable to face the dissonance between what they'd been told and what they were hearing. For the Allies, language was a tool, a means of extracting intelligence, maintaining order, or easing fear. But, for the Japanese prisoners, it was something deeper, proof that the enemy could understand them, not just command them. At the heart of this shift were men who had studied Japan long before the war. Missionaries, scholars, linguists, and second-generation Japanese Americans known as Nisei. These interpreters carried not only words, but empathy, a bridge of culture amid the wreckage of war. In those moments, under the tropical sun or behind the wire fences of Australia, something fragile began to form. A quiet recognition that kindness could be more terrifying than cruelty. Because it forced the prisoners to question everything they had believed. About the enemy, about honor, about themselves. That was the hidden battle of the Pacific's final year. Not fought with rifles, but with words, gestures, and silence. And as more prisoners arrived, this battle of humanity would deepen. Some would resist it. Others would be transformed by it. The camps, in time, became not just holding grounds for defeated soldiers, but mirrors reflecting the war's deepest moral questions. By late 1944, the Allied command had begun to recognize a new kind of battlefield, the one inside the minds of captured Japanese soldiers. Victory in the Pacific was not just a matter of defeating Japan's armies. It required breaking through years of indoctrination that made surrender unthinkable. Across the Pacific and the Indian Ocean, prisoner-of-war camps began to fill. In the Philippines, New Guinea, and on the Australian mainland, thousands of Japanese prisoners arrived under guard. Their uniforms tattered, their faces expressionless, their spirits fractured. Some were captured after being wounded, others after being cut off from their units. All carried the same invisible weight, the unbearable shame of being alive. At Camp Hay in Australia, and at facilities across the Hawaiian Islands and the U.S. mainland, the Allies faced a question they had not anticipated. How do you hold men who believe captivity itself is a crime? The official answer came from the Geneva Convention of 1929, which required humane treatment of prisoners. Food, shelter, medical care, and the right to correspondence were guaranteed. The Allies, mindful of their own men held by Japan in brutal conditions, wanted to show the world the contrast. This was not revenge, it was moral discipline. But reality on the ground was more complex. Many Allied soldiers had fought in places like Tarawa or Buna, where surrender was rare and mercy even rarer. Their comrades had been killed after offering to surrender, or mutilated after battle. The hatred ran deep. The idea of showing compassion to those same enemies felt, to some, like betrayal. Yet there were others, officers, chaplains, and intelligence men, who saw the psychological potential in humane treatment. Every act of decency could become an instrument of persuasion. Every gesture of respect could open a door that interrogation never could. That was where language became power. In several Allied armies, programs were launched to train interpreters fluent in Japanese. Some were Nisei, Japanese Americans who volunteered to serve in the military intelligence service despite the internment of their families back home. Others were missionaries who had once lived in Japan, or linguists from pre-war academia. These men knew not only the grammar of the language, but the spirit beneath it, the subtle forms of respect, humility, and rank that governed Japanese communication. Their task was not just translation, it was mediation between worlds that no longer trusted each other. When a Nisei interpreter entered a camp and greeted prisoners with "Gokurosama deshita," a phrase of appreciation for hard work, it disarmed suspicion more effectively than any rifle. The prisoners would stare in disbelief, unsure whether to bow or remain rigid. Some, overwhelmed, would break down in tears. Reports from the period describe these moments vividly. At camps in Australia, a few Japanese officers regained a sense of dignity through simple conversation. One interpreter recalled a prisoner whispering, "I did not know Americans could speak like this." Another asked quietly, "If you understand us so well, why do we still fight?" For the guards, this was more than duty. It became a quiet, moral experiment. Could humanity itself be a weapon against fanaticism? Over time, camp routines stabilized. Prisoners were put to work on farms, in workshops, or on maintenance crews. They received medical care and mail from home through the Red Cross. Some learned English. Others began teaching Japanese to their captors. Still, there were outbreaks of defiance, whispered plans of suicide, hunger strikes, and the occasional violent incident. The shame of capture never truly left them. But through language, small transformations began. Men who once refused to speak started to write letters again. Those who once turned their backs began to meet their guards' eyes. The Japanese government would never acknowledge these camps during the war. But for the men inside them, they became small islands of humanity in an ocean of brutality. The world outside still burned, from Okinawa to Hiroshima. But behind the barbed wire, another kind of battle was quietly unfolding. One between the ghosts of propaganda and the fragile reality of kindness. And within that unseen struggle, new perspectives began to form, both among the prisoners and those guarding them. The Japanese prisoners who entered Allied camps in 1944 and 1945 were not merely defeated soldiers. They were men stripped of identity. To them, capture was not survival. It was erasure. In the code they had been raised with, a man who surrendered ceased to exist as a warrior, as a son, even as a human being. Inside the camps, this psychological burden was visible everywhere. Many refused to look up when spoken to. Some covered their faces when Allied guards approached. At night, whispers ran through the barracks. Fears of execution, rumors of poison, stories that the rice contained ground bones. The smallest gesture of normalcy, a shared cigarette, a cup of coffee, a casual word in Japanese, could trigger tears or panic. One American guard at Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, wrote later that the silence was heavier than the heat. It was the sound of men trying to disappear from their own shame. Yet that silence also became the stage upon which something remarkable unfolded, the gradual rediscovery of trust. The guards who spoke Japanese, or who treated the prisoners with fairness, became living contradictions to the stories they had been told. When these men addressed the captives with politeness, using phrases like san or sensei, it was not only linguistically accurate, it was deeply symbolic. It recognized the prisoner as a person again, and this simple acknowledgement began to break down the most rigid barrier of all: fear. To the Allied intelligence officers, humane treatment was not a moral luxury. It was a strategic necessity. By 1944, interrogators had learned that brutal questioning yielded little from Japanese soldiers. Torture or threats only reinforced their indoctrination. Many preferred death to cooperation. But when treated with respect, when offered cigarettes, tea, or even small talk, their defenses began to waver. The military intelligence service in the Pacific quickly recognized this pattern. Psychological reports from the period noted that polite language produces disarming effects among prisoners accustomed to severity. Through patient questioning, interpreters uncovered critical details about troop movements, logistics, and morale. At Guadalcanal and in the Philippines, humane interrogation directly influenced operational planning. Kindness had become a weapon, subtle, effective, and deeply unsettling to those who wielded it. For Japanese soldiers, this was the ultimate paradox. The enemy, whom they were told to hate and fear, showed restraint. They were being defeated not only on the battlefield, but on moral ground. And for many Allied personnel, it was equally transformative. They began to see the prisoners not as faceless fanatics, but as men, products of a system as unrelenting as war itself. The voice that bridged these worlds often belonged to a man who had lived in both. Second-generation Japanese Americans, the Nisei, served as translators and interpreters for the U.S. Army's Military Intelligence Service. Many had been interned or had families in relocation camps back home. Yet they volunteered to serve the very country that had questioned their loyalty. Their presence in the camps was more than operational, it was deeply symbolic. Here were men who looked Japanese, spoke Japanese, but wore Allied uniforms. To the prisoners, they were ghosts of possibility, proof that identity could be more complex than the black and white lines drawn by propaganda. One Nisei interpreter later wrote, "When I spoke to the prisoners, I could feel the shock in their eyes. I was supposed to be their kin, yet I spoke with the voice of the enemy. But because of that, they listened." The Nisei brought a level of cultural fluency no textbook could teach. They understood tatame and hon, the surface face and the true feeling, and they navigated the hierarchy of speech that shaped every Japanese conversation. They knew when to bow, when to use formal honorifics, when to pause in silence. This was not simply translation. It was diplomacy conducted in whispers. In several camps, the interpreters went beyond duty. They taught guards Japanese etiquette, how to hand a bowl of rice properly, how to avoid gestures that might offend. The smallest courtesies carried immense weight. When a guard said "itadakimasu" before eating, the prisoners noticed, and in those moments, something shifted. The line between captor and captive blurred, replaced by a fragile thread of recognition. To the outside world, these were invisible acts, but inside the camps, they were revolutions of the heart, fought not with weapons, but with words. The next set of angles explores what this fragile humanity meant for those on both sides. The moral and leadership dimensions that turned these quiet encounters into powerful acts of conscience. To many, Allied soldiers, showing kindness to Japanese prisoners was one of the hardest things they ever did. The memories of the Pacific battlefield were too fresh. Friends ambushed after surrendering, corpses mutilated. The cruelty of the camps in Burma and Bataan burned into their minds. The hatred was not abstract, it was personal, and yet within the wire, some guards chose to break that cycle. They offered food before questions, shared cigarettes without conditions, and spoke calmly to men who had once tried to kill them. It was not forgiveness, it was discipline, a conscious refusal to become what they despised. Psychologists who later studied these interactions described them as moral shock. For the Japanese prisoners, kindness was disorienting. It forced them to confront an impossible contradiction. The enemy they were taught to hate was behaving with compassion. For many, this realization produced a crisis of belief more painful than defeat itself. Some prisoners, overwhelmed by guilt, wept openly. Others, unable to reconcile kindness with honor, turned inward in silence. But over time, something began to shift. A few wrote letters home describing the humanity of their captors, letters that would have been unimaginable a year earlier. These small, quiet moments of empathy were not meant to heal the wounds of war. Yet they hinted at something extraordinary. Even in humanity's darkest hour, decency could still survive. Behind these individual acts stood commanders who made deliberate choices. Men like Brigadier A.R. Garrett in Australia and Colonel Sidney Mashbeer of the U.S. Military Intelligence Service believed that humane treatment was not weakness. It was strategy and principle combined. Garrett, overseeing Japanese POWs at Hay and Cowra, insisted that the camps operate under the letter of the Geneva Convention. "Our conduct," he wrote in his reports, "must be the mirror of what we wish to see in return." His policies emphasized discipline, order, and respect, a formula that not all subordinates accepted easily. At Cowra, a tragic breakout in 1944, when hundreds of Japanese prisoners attempted to storm the wire in a suicidal escape, underscored the complexity of his task. Even after the chaos, when hundreds lay dead or wounded, Garrett ordered that the fallen be buried with full military honors. The message was unmistakable. Even an enemy who refused to live with honor would be allowed to die with it. Colonel Mashbeer's leadership in the Pacific had a different tone, but the same spirit. Having lived in Japan before the war, he understood the culture's deep sense of shame and hierarchy. Under his command, Nisei linguists were trained not only to translate, but to understand. They learned the value of tone, posture, and subtlety in breaking through psychological barriers. In their reports, these men described how small courtesies, a bow, a phrase of respect, achieved more than any threat ever could. Respect is the beginning of understanding, Mashbeer once wrote, and understanding is the beginning of victory. Through these choices, leaders on both sides of the wire demonstrated a rare kind of courage. The moral courage to remain human amid dehumanization. For many Japanese prisoners, the kindness of their captors was more terrifying than any weapon. It struck at the core of their belief system, the Bushido code that equated mercy with weakness and the enemy with evil. When they were greeted politely, when they were thanked for their labor, when guards bowed slightly in return, it shattered the narratives drilled into them by years of militarism. How could an enemy who showed respect also be a barbarian? One former prisoner later recalled, "I expected pain. Instead, I found patience. That was harder to endure." Another wrote in his memoir, decades later, that the Americans did not break us with violence. They broke us with understanding. In some camps, relationships developed quietly. A few prisoners began teaching guards how to write their names in Japanese. Others volunteered to translate letters for fellow captives. When the war finally ended, there were even instances of prisoners thanking their guards with handmade gifts or poems, small tokens of gratitude that defied the hatred both sides had been taught. For the guards, too, these moments left a mark. Many later said the prisoners reminded them that war, at its heart, was a contest of illusions, and that beneath the uniforms and slogans, men were men. The moral and emotional collisions inside those camps revealed something larger than strategy or survival. They showed that the boundaries of war were not only drawn by nations, but by the choices of individuals, to hate, to fear, or to understand. And yet, as the war neared its final year, those boundaries would be tested in ways no one could have imagined. For beyond the quiet civility of the camps, the world itself was about to change. From Okinawa to Hiroshima, in acts so devastating they would redefine the meaning of mercy. Before dawn on August 5, 1944, the winter wind rolled cold over the quiet farmlands of New South Wales, Australia. Inside a sprawling barbed wire enclosure known as Cowra Camp, nearly 1,000 Japanese prisoners lay awake. The air was heavy with silence, a silence that hid something vast and terrible beneath it. For weeks, whispers had moved through the compound, rumors that Japan's defeat was imminent, that prisoners would soon be transferred, possibly to another camp, or worse, executed. In reality, the transfer meant only relocation, but to men raised under the Bushido Code, where capture was shame and death was duty, the rumor felt like truth. The commandant of the camp, Lieutenant Colonel Montague D. Jarman, had no idea that on this cold night hundreds of men had made a vow. They would not be moved. They would die with honor, not live in humiliation. At 1:50 a.m., a single trumpet sounded in the darkness. Then another. Moments later, shouts erupted. "Banzai! Banzai!" The cry of the imperial soldiers charging into death. The guards at the perimeter were stunned. From the huts came waves of prisoners armed with handmade weapons, sharpened table knives, baseball bats, even bedposts. They stormed the wire, tearing through it with blankets and bare hands, trying to overpower machine gun posts and rush into open fields. The guards, shocked and outnumbered, opened fire. For 15 chaotic minutes, the camp became a scene of confusion and horror. Bullets ripped through the night, flames rose from burning huts, and bodies fell among the wire. Some prisoners reached the outer fences. Others turned their weapons on themselves. By dawn, over 230 Japanese were dead, and 4 Australian soldiers lay killed. It was the largest prisoner breakout of the Second World War. But the real story was not the violence. It was what followed. When the gunfire stopped, the survivors expected punishment. They braced for retaliation, torture, or starvation. Instead, something else happened. The camp commander, shaken but resolute, ordered the dead to be treated with dignity. The Japanese bodies were buried in a formal ceremony, their graves marked, their names recorded. Australian officers saluted as the flags were lowered. One of them later wrote, "We fought them as soldiers. We would bury them as men." The gesture spread through the camp like a quiet wind. The surviving prisoners, many injured, watched in disbelief as their fallen comrades were honored by the very enemy they had tried to kill. The illusion of barbarism, that the Allies were beasts without respect or morality, began to dissolve under the weight of that single act. In the weeks that followed, order returned. The guards did not speak of revenge. Instead, they enforced routine with calm authority. They treated wounds, rebuilt huts, and restored normalcy. For many of the prisoners, it was unbearable to receive humanity where they expected cruelty. One interpreter at Cowra later recalled how several officers, broken by shame, asked why their enemy had shown them such honor. He answered simply, "Because that is what soldiers do." The Cowra breakout marked a turning point, not only in Australia, but in how the Allies understood the psychology of the Japanese soldier. It revealed the depth of fear and indoctrination that had driven even unarmed men to suicidal revolt. But it also showed that dignity, not domination, could be the most powerful weapon of all. From that point on, Allied administrators and interpreters across the Pacific began to see humane treatment not as weakness, but as an act of quiet defiance, a way to reclaim moral ground in a war that had consumed so much of it. The story of Cowra spread, whispered by guards, written in reports, carried in the memories of men who would never forget that night when duty clashed with compassion. And compassion endured. But as the smoke settled over Cowra, another storm was already gathering, far across the Pacific, where the island of Okinawa was about to become the last and bloodiest test of Japan's resolve and the last chance for mercy to prove its power amid total devastation. April 1945. Okinawa, the final crucible of the Pacific War. For nearly 3 months, American forces advanced across a landscape shattered by artillery and soaked in rain and blood. Between the thunder of naval bombardments and the roar of tanks, tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers and civilians clung to the caves, refusing to surrender. To them, capture meant dishonor. Every man, woman, and child had been taught that the Americans would torture, mutilate, and slaughter. Leaflets distributed by the Imperial Army warned civilians that the enemy would commit unspeakable acts. Mothers were told to kill their children rather than let them fall into Allied hands. And yet, as the battle reached its final days, the truth began to surface in ways that no propaganda could silence. In the shattered hills near Shuri Castle, a small group of Japanese soldiers emerged from a cave, waving a makeshift white flag. They were skeletal, filthy, their uniforms reduced to rags. American Marines raised their rifles, then paused. One of the Marines, a Nisei interpreter, stepped forward. He spoke softly in Japanese. You will not be harmed. Put down your weapons. The prisoners froze. For a long moment, they stared at him. His Asian face, his perfect Japanese. To them, it was impossible. An American speaking their language with compassion? It was as though the world had turned upside down. One soldier began to sob uncontrollably. Another collapsed to his knees, whispering, "Yorushite kudasai." Forgive us. It was a scene repeated across the island. Civilians and soldiers alike, driven by hunger and terror, began to surrender, hesitantly at first, then in growing numbers, as word spread that the enemy could be reasoned with. The Allied forces had discovered the one weapon Japan's militarists had never prepared for: empathy. The turning point came when American psychological warfare teams began using loudspeakers and leaflets written in flawless Japanese. But it wasn't just the language. It was the tone. Instead of threats, the messages offered life. Lay down your arms. You will be treated well. You will have food and water. You will see Japan again. For a people told that surrender meant mutilation, these words carried unimaginable weight. Soldiers began to creep out at night, hands raised. Some carried their wounded on makeshift stretchers, trusting their captors more than their commanders. Reports from the field describe scenes that bordered on the surreal. Marines sharing cigarettes with captured Japanese. Corpsmen treating enemy wounds before their own. Prisoners, bewildered by kindness, bowing in gratitude. In the ruins of Okinawa, humanity had re-emerged, fragile, uncertain, but real. One of the most powerful moments came near the end of the campaign, when American soldiers discovered hundreds of civilians hiding in a limestone cave. The interpreter called into the darkness, assuring them they would not be harmed. At first, only silence. Then, the sound of sobbing. A woman emerged, clutching a baby. Behind her, families followed. Gaunt, terrified, but alive. Later, that same interpreter wrote in his journal, "They did not believe my words. They believed my voice." It was in these moments that the language barrier, once a wall of fear, became a bridge of survival. The human voice, steady and calm, carried more power than all the leaflets and propaganda combined. Okinawa was the costliest battle of the Pacific. Over 200,000 dead, including more than 100,000 civilians. Yet within that horror, seeds of understanding were planted. Prisoners began to speak of their captors not as devils, but as men. They told one another in hushed voices that the Americans kept their word, that they were fed, tended to, even respected. In the prisoner enclosures that followed, those same voices carried into the post-war years. Men who had expected death began to write again, to record, to remember, to question what they had been taught. For some, it was too late. The shame of surrender remained unbearable. But for others, the kindness they received in those final days would become the first spark of transformation. A realization that mercy could exist even after annihilation. Okinawa ended with ruin. Hiroshima and Nagasaki would soon follow. But amid the ashes, the memory of those who spoke gently to their enemies, who extended language, compassion, and understanding instead of cruelty, would endure. They had proven something no weapon could, that even in total war, the human voice could still reach across the smoke and rubble and remind both sides of what it meant to be alive. In the months that followed, the guns would fall silent. Japan would surrender, and the men who had lived through captivity, both guards and prisoners, would begin to reckon with what came next, a peace as uneasy and complex as the war itself. In the long shadow of the Pacific War, the images that endured were those of fire, burning cities, kamikaze dives, and mushroom clouds. But somewhere far from those infernos, behind barbed wire and watchtowers, another image quietly rewrote what it meant to win. A guard speaking gently in the prisoner's own language. A man who once swore never to bow, now bowing in return, a silence that no longer meant hatred, but understanding. The war had divided the world by race, ideology, and fear. Yet within the prisoner camps, something fragile survived. A reminder that even in the machinery of total war, humanity could not be fully erased. The act of speaking the enemy's tongue, of seeing him not as a symbol, but as a man, became a form of defiance against everything war demanded. The Japanese prisoners, stripped of weapons and pride, discovered that the enemy's kindness could wound deeper than his bullets, because kindness forced reflection. It revealed that hatred was not absolute, that the line between honor and cruelty had never been clear. For the Allied guards, too, the encounter left a mark. They entered the camps as victors, but left with an uneasy truth, that their strength had meant nothing without restraint. Power had destroyed armies. Only compassion could restore meaning. In the years that followed, both sides carried this quiet revelation into peace. It did not make them friends overnight. It did not erase the dead. But it planted the idea, small, persistent, and deeply human, that understanding could outlast vengeance. History would remember the great battles, Midway, Leyte, Okinawa. Yet in the stillness of those prison compounds, far from the front lines, the real victory may have been something else entirely. The rediscovery of empathy after a world had forgotten what it was. War had taught nations how to destroy. Language taught them how to heal. And in those fleeting moments when the guards spoke with kindness and the prisoners whispered back, not in fear, but in recognition, humanity, bruised but unbroken, spoke to itself once more.